What's up, guys? I hope you had a great weekend. I hope you can hear me because it's really windy. It was a weekend full of motorsport, wasn't it? If you're a motorsport fan, this was a dream come true. It was the Chinese Grand Prix, it was the Rome E-Prix, and it was also the Long Beach IndyCar race. And I watched a bit of all of them. I definitely watched the Grand Prix, of course. I watched the Formula E race. I managed to see qualifying for the IndyCar race, which is the first time, really, that I've managed to sit down and actually get into any kind of IndyCar action. And I liked it. It was pretty raw, it was rough and ready, had some great camera angles. The helmet cam that they use in IndyCar is absolutely brilliant. Almost driver's eye view, I guess, of how he's fighting with the wheel and running incredibly close to the wall. So I really liked that. I thought it was a great thing. I'd love to see it in Formula One. Anyway, so brilliant weekend, loads of great action. It's provided loads of brilliant questions. So many questions that I've been through and selected a load, and I think this could end up being quite a long one. So strap in. I hope you enjoy it. And at the end, of course, I will also be picking a winner for the prize giveaway from the preview video, which is, of course, that amazing graffiti, unique painting of Michael Schumacher by DrAutoArt. So stick around to the end, and if you enter that competition on Instagram, you could well be walking away with that painting. So I'm on daddy duty this week because it's school holidays, of course. Rex is away at football week, but Ginger Ginger is under my control for the week, so good luck to her. But she's also going to be a little helper today, and so I hope will help me pick the winner of the competition later. Anyway, let's get into these questions. I'm going to start without not a specific question, because so many people sent tweets asking about the Chinese Grand Prix and the Ferrari, I guess the Ferrari decisions. I will get into some more specific tweets in a moment, but just cover off this to start with. Lots of people saying, what on earth happened? Why did Ferrari do what they did? Should they have switched their drivers? Basically what went wrong. And to cover it off in a broader sense, in terms of the driver switch, the team orders, I would have probably done the same. They clearly had Sebastian sitting behind Charles and being held up at that point. He had DRS, so he's all over the back of Charles, which indicates he's being held up. There is no absolute indication of what his ultimate pace could be at that point, because he's being held up. You don't really know what his ultimate pace is until you release him and send him off into some clean air. And so they had to try and do that, because otherwise it would have compromised probably both drivers' race. So they allowed them to switch, or they told him to switch and sent him on his way. As it turned out, Seb probably wasn't a huge amount quicker. Seb had been on the radio telling the team that he could match Lewis Hamilton's times, and as it turned out, he couldn't. But I don't blame the team for that. I'd have probably done the same, at least to give it a try. Then there's the argument, should they have switched them back? Potentially. I mean, if you want to keep it nice and fair, then maybe you should. But you also then get into slight complications of trying to arrange a switch back, and Charles really wasn't close enough beyond that point to really effectively do that. So I don't blame Ferrari for that. Okay, that brings me on to the next bit of Ferrari's day, which Mark Jones has asked this particular question. Ginger, do you want to help me out here?
Please. Hi Mark, just wondered what your thoughts are on the Leclerc strategy. Surely it would have been better to pit Leclerc first for his second stop. He would have got the undercut on Verstappen, which might have brought him back into play for fourth.
Excellent work, Ginger. Thank you very much. And it's a good question, and one, again, that lots of people asked. And the truth is that, yes, if they, with a bit of hindsight, and of course it's always much easier with hindsight, they could have brought Leclerc in earlier and been a bit more aggressive and kind of led the way in terms of that second round of stops. So they could have brought Leclerc in earlier and actually sort of fended off the undercut from Verstappen. But what they would have done then is potentially leave Sebastian open to the undercut for Verstappen. And although there was a small gap that Sebastian had, so less likely to have lost out on the undercut, it was still a risk. And don't forget, Seb was their lead driver at that time. So their thinking was probably that they needed to try and protect Sebastian's position on the racetrack, his third place. That's what was most important to the team at that point. So pitting Leclerc, whilst it might have worked, would have potentially opened up a risk to Sebastian. So that, I imagine, is what they were thinking. I think in reality, when they look back at it, they will probably analyse it and say, yeah, maybe they should have done things slightly differently. But that's what they did, and we all know the result. It cost Charles that fourth place. And actually, what happened was Ferrari went from a race where, yeah, they weren't quick enough to beat the Mercedes in Shanghai. And so third and fourth was probably the places that they deserved to have. But they kind of threw that away to some extent and ended up with third and fifth. So they lost out on maximising the result the car could achieve. That leads nicely onto this question from Harry John Cope, who says, do Mercedes genuinely have a car that deserves 3 back-to-back 1-2s, or are the teams, drivers, mechanics, strategists, etc., just getting it right on the day? Well, the reality is that you've hit the nail on the head. Yes, Mercedes are getting it all right on the day. And do they have a car that's genuinely worthy of 3 back-to-backs? Probably not, just on absolute car pace. I mean, absolutely, we saw in Bahrain that Ferrari should have dominated that weekend, should have walked away with an easy 1-2. I mean, not an easy 1-2, but a 1-2. And they didn't, and they did it because they kind of imploded in various areas, didn't they? Car failures, driver failures. Mercedes have just been consistently good all the way through. You saw even yesterday making decisions like double stacking their drivers in the pit stops. That's a risky move. That's a strategy that adds some risk into their day, and yet they were confident enough in their team to do it. And that's the difference between getting it all right and just not quite getting it all right. And unfortunately, in modern Formula One, where things are so slick and so professional, the only way to maximise your result is to get absolutely everything right on the day. And absolutely, Mercedes is doing that. They've got every single area of their business, of their team, of their organisation has massive strength in depth, and that's why they've been successful, even on days when their car is not the fastest. And you can apply that to last year and other seasons as well. Last year particularly, they definitely didn't have the quickest car for large parts of the season, and yet they still came out on top. They maximised results where Ferrari just didn't quite. And that's not, I don't want to be too harsh on Ferrari. They are not making lots and lots of massive errors. They're getting tiny things wrong. But that's the difference between winning and losing in Formula One. Right, Carl Slocum asks this one. Simple one this week, Elvis. What the hell is going on? Were Merc sandbagging in testing? Were Ferrari showboating for headlines? Are Merc just out-developing Ferrari? Or do the red team have an underlying issue that's become apparent? Confusion reigns. Well, Carl, it's understandable that there's some confusion, isn't there? Because we all thought, or lots of people thought at the beginning of the season, after pre-season testing, it was a one-horse race. Ferrari going to walk away with it, and the championship was almost done and dusted. Because that's what the timesheets from Barcelona kind of represented. But, I said this all along throughout pre-season testing, the timesheets are not the only thing, the only reference point to go by. They're obviously the headline because that's what we as fans get. We don't get to see the data that each team gets to see, and that's what, by far gives the biggest indication of where each team is at. What we're seeing is two very different cars. The Mercedes and the Ferrari have different strengths and weaknesses. They will become apparent at different circuits, and one team will be stronger at some circuits than at others. That's what we've seen already. We've only had 3 races, let's not forget. There's a long way to go. Lots can change, lots will be developed. Both teams are already bringing developments to the car, and so that performance swing will start to migrate and start to shift as the season goes. Both teams will start to appreciate where their weaknesses and their strengths lie, and they will try to develop out of those weaknesses and improve on the strengths, of course. So the swing between different types of track could well shift as the season goes on, but absolutely I don't think Mercedes was sandbagging in testing. I genuinely just don't believe that happens. I also don't think Ferrari are the sort of team that would go for headline lap times, showboating as you called it. Just don't think that's happened. I think Ferrari had a car, and I mentioned this before, that hit the ground running in Barcelona. On day one, they were quick, they were reliable, they were banging in, hundreds of laps, very fast laps, and that meant that they didn't really have to, you know, they didn't really discover the weaknesses, if you like, for their car as easily as Mercedes did. And when you discover your weaknesses, it's much easier then to develop out of those weaknesses, to develop solutions to them, to work your way around problems. And Ferrari didn't really have too many problems. So I suspect then when they got to Australia, a completely different type of circuit, different conditions, Mercedes were perhaps better prepared in terms of how they develop the strengths and weaknesses of their car. So that's going to continue as the season goes on, and I just think we've got a great championship set up. So I don't think there's anything necessarily going on. I think Ferrari have got work to do, because even when they've had the strongest car, like in Bahrain, they didn't maximise it. And again, perhaps you could argue that this weekend. So they've definitely got work to do. Mercedes are just incredibly slick as an operation. And that is the biggest difference for me. That's, you know, when they had a failure, and this happens over the past few years, when they've had a failure or a bad race, they have been very open and very honest about those failures and about where they need to work. And they've gone away, worked incredibly hard and dug themselves out of those situations. And for me, that's the biggest thing that's happened in the first 3 races of this season, and I'm sure will continue. Ferrari have to up their game if they're going to stay in the hunt for this championship. Right, Chris Nigel asks this one. He says, Ferrari in Melbourne has had a wrong setup, and yet Max said they did the same with their cars in Bahrain. How on earth could that be possible in 2019, bearing in mind the enormous computational powers that they have nowadays and many days of simulations back at home? Well, I know that seems really straightforward, to be able to plug something into a computer, type in a challenge or problem, and the computer spits out an answer. You know, it does that to a large extent. It's a massive tool in terms of development, but it doesn't give you an absolute setup answer for certain conditions on a certain race weekend on a certain day. That's something that has to happen on the ground. That's what the team have to work through on a Friday. Yeah, of course they use the simulation tools to help with that. But in terms of setup direction, they're very much reliant on a combination of that data that they're collecting, and also feedback from a driver, an engineer's, you know, own experience as to which way to go. There's a combination of all of those things, and because the cars are so sensitive now, they're so at the, you know, absolute top 1% of performance, very close to perfection, if you like. It takes a tiny little error or a tiny wrong direction change in terms of setup to then get lost in that process throughout the weekend. And although that it seems like they've got plenty of time, the reality is 2 sessions on a Friday, one of those, you know, FP1 is not normally that representative when it comes to the rest of the weekend. It's easy to take a slight change of direction or go down a path of setup that actually can lead you in completely the wrong direction as the weekend progresses, because you're either following that path in the wrong direction or changing something because the car doesn't feel like right when you've made that change. It can spiral out of control very quickly, and those are the kind of things that just genuinely can happen even in 2019 with all the tools available. And actually, do you know what? I love that. You know, I love the fact there has to be a human element to this, to getting the setup right and to getting the development path right. If it was all down to computers, everybody would end up with exactly the same kind of thing. But what we're doing is we're looking for the human element, the very best people in the business to make the right decisions, whether it's the driver, the engineer, the designer, whoever it might be. So that really is the answer to that question. Right, a couple of Formula E based questions now. First one from Paul of Woe, who says, can you explain how the 45 minutes plus 1 lap works in Formula E? How important was it for Mitch to slow down on the last couple of laps in Rome? Well, that's a good question, Paul, because that's a brand new thing for Formula E in Season 5 for this championship. The race is no longer determined by or defined by a number of laps. It's now defined by a 45-minute period, so a clock that counts down from 45 minutes to 0. When that clock ticks down to 0, the next time the cars cross the finish line, they start what will then be their final lap. So it's 45 minutes plus 1 more full lap to complete the race. So what happened in Rome at the weekend was Mitch Evans, driving for Jaguar, found himself out in front, leading the race. Andre Lotterer chasing him down hard behind.
We need to do what we can to block Lotterer and slow the race down. Slow the race down.
And his engineers were coming on the radio telling him to slow the pace down, to actually slow the car down and essentially take longer to get to the end of the race. So essentially what they were trying to do was make sure that Mitch didn't cross the line before that 45 minutes went down to 0 at the end of the race. Because if he'd done that, he would have had to do one more lap, and then the next time he crossed the finish line, that would then start the +1 lap, the final lap of the race, essentially making the lap or the race 1 lap longer than they really wanted it to be. And the reason for that was that they'd done all their energy calculations based on what they predicted to be the total race distance in terms of number of laps. They're constantly adapting that and adjusting that calculation as the race goes on, and 1 extra lap in the race can really make a massive difference to the way that your energy lasts over the course of the E-Prix. And you know, the Nissan guys found that out. In fact, the whole field really had that highlighted to them in the Mexico City E-Prix, where the 2 Nissan cars failed to finish.
Ronald's got 2%, he's not going to make it. Buemi's got 2% as well.
Nissan miscalculated.
They'd miscalculated when they thought the 45 minutes was going to come to an end, and therefore how many laps they had left. The leaders crossed the line, you know, before that 45 minutes had ticked down to 0, and therefore they had to complete another lap before they then got the final lap flag. And so that they were all very aware of that happening, that it cost Nissan a great result in Mexico City. And so when Mitch Evans is sitting out front for the first time looking at potentially winning a race, the first time Jaguar were about to win a race, he's got his engineers telling him slow the pace.
Slow down, slow down.
Oh, goodness me. This is a...
Mate, tell me how much.
Try to lose 2 seconds this lap to be safe.
And with Andre Lotterer desperate to find a way past, filling his rear-view mirrors. And from a driver's perspective, what he's then having to do is, you know, he's not just going slowly, he's having to lift off a little bit early at the safe sections of the circuit, places where he thinks he can't be overtaken. He's got to position his car in a way that he cannot let Lotterer get by, but he's got to slow the overall lap time down. That's not an easy thing to achieve. It's probably the last message you want to hear as a racing driver, because racing drivers are all about going as fast as they possibly can. So a difficult thing for Mitch to do, but he did it absolutely to perfection. He managed to let the clock tick down, managed to lower his pace so that when he came round to finish what he assumed would be his penultimate lap, the clock had just ticked down to 0. He then crossed the line to start the final lap and was able to just do that one final lap to finish the E-Prix. It all worked to perfection. Mitch got his first victory in Formula E. Jaguar Racing got their first victory in Formula E as well. And it was a great result, a well-deserved result. A result that's been a long time coming. So congratulations to all of them. But I hope that gives some explanation as to why we have this 45 minutes plus 1 lap and the impact that it can have on a race. Leaf Bolskiff asks this one: having previewed the Formula E tracks, which elements would you like to see more of, and which do you think, like turn 13 in Rome for example, they should try and get rid of to improve racing? And are there any cities in your opinion which would make great FE tracks? Well, the thing about Formula E racing, or street city racing, city centre racing in general, is that you are very much your track layout is very much determined by the existing road network within that city, isn't it? Obviously, you can't just go and design whatever you want, so you have to make best use of what's there. And I think Formula E actually do a really good job of that. You know, it's about making the tracks as wide as they can possibly be within, you know, the sort of confines of what's there in terms of curbs, trees, buildings, that kind of stuff. And I think they do, you know, that Formula E are now very experienced at making the best of what they've got. And you can look at some Formula E tracks on a bit of paper, on a map, and go, do you know what, that track looks awful. You know, how on earth is that going to provide a great race? And yet we've had that so many times, and you get to the race and it's still spectacular. And I think that's a mentality thing. The drivers and the teams in Formula E realise they can't do anything about the circuit, so they've still got to find a way past. They've still got to find a way to overtake and move forward in the race. And so they kind of calculate risk differently to perhaps you might on a more traditional circuit. They have to take more risks in terms of lunges down the inside into corners, bumping wheels occasionally, because the cars are pretty sturdy and they can afford to do it. So it's a different type of racing, and I think it's provided some really spectacular action, motorsport action. Yes, there've been this season, there've been, you know, a lot of red flags, a lot of stoppages after big accidents, and I think there is a larger question mark to say that with the new Generation 2 cars, and if we fast forward even further beyond, as the electric cars become more and more powerful, which they will do, speeds become faster and faster, maybe Formula E will end up outgrowing the street tracks that we're able to create in a city centre. And that's a bigger question. Do we then have to move to a more traditional racetrack scenario? Not something that Formula E ever intended to do. It's all about bringing the racing to the heart of a city centre, and I love that. But you know, we've got a faster car this year, we've got a bigger car this year, and we are seeing a lot more stoppages and interrupted racing, and maybe that's the first signs that Formula E might be getting too quick, too powerful, just too fast for the tight city centre street tracks that we currently race on. In terms of where I'd love to see a race, I was in Toronto last summer on a family holiday, and it struck me back then how wide the streets were, how clean they were, how kind of smooth they were. And it really struck me as thinking this could make a great Formula E track. So I'd love to see Formula E or any kind of street centre racing, city centre racing going to Toronto. I think it could make a great street track layout. But let me know what you think. Are there any cities that you think around the world would make a great track for street racing, whether it's Formula 1 or Formula E? Jack says, when teams leave the cars and all the equipment overnight during the weekend, do they have security at the circuit or specific team security to look after everything? He says, loving the channel. Well, thanks very much, Jack. Lovely to have you with us. The answer to that question is that what he's talking about is at the end of a day at the racetrack, when everything's locked up in the garage, does the circuit provide its own security, or do the teams provide their own? And the answer to that is both. The circuit has its own security. FOM, or Formula 1, put on their own circuit security as well. And the teams normally, in fact I think pretty much every team, employs their own security guards overnight as well. So literally there'll be somebody standing at the entrance to the garage. The front doors, of course, the shutters are down and locked, but the back door of the garage is being guarded constantly 24 hours a day by a member of the team's own security. Okay, this next question comes from somebody with an amazing, I think that was on Twitter handle. I have so many questions about your Twitter handle. Shagger likes axes. Asks this question. How is CFD software usage restricted? It seems like an impossible thing to restrict, pretty much like the budget cap. Anyone can buy a lot of processing power from their private computer without anybody knowing about it, and even quite cheap. So how's it done? It's a good question, and it is a bit like the budget cap. There are very strict restrictions on how much computer power you're able to use, and it's measured in terms of teraflops. You are only allowed a certain number of teraflops of CFD usage over the course of a season or a month or whatever. What happens is that all that usage, that CFD usage, has to be logged, very strictly logged by the teams, and then it has to be submitted to the FIA, you know, to keep monitor on it. If the FIA want to ever have access to those logs at any other time, they can absolutely request that, but it's very much self-policed. And you could say, well, that's crazy. You know, that's such a big performance differentiator. How can it be self-policed? The reality is, though, if you're a big team and you get caught breaching those regulations, the consequences of that are enormous. Not only in terms of sporting or even maybe financial fines, that kind of consequence, but the consequence to your brand if you are suddenly caught and branded as a cheat, which is what you would be, are just not worth the risk. And so actually it's one of those self-policing things, and I suspect when it comes to budget caps, that kind of same principle would apply. If you put in some serious consequences to breaching the regulations or the rules, teams generally just won't do it. Every now and again, of course, we've got history littered with cases where people have cheated. It happens, you know, very rarely, and when it happens, it tends to be a massive story that gets blown open, you know, wide open. So the reality is that most people just wouldn't do it. Right, let's wrap up with this one from Helge Coistra, who says, the setup can't be changed between quali and race, but the engine settings, i.e. party mode, can. Isn't that strange? Would it be more equal to let the teams run the race with the engine setting they qualified in? Now, I've discussed this on Twitter with Helga, so I disagree with that. I don't think that that's the right thing to do, and the reason I say that is that when you allow teams to crank everything up on a Saturday to number 11 on the dial, you know, and get the absolute maximum out of it without any real concerns over longevity, because they're looking at one flying lap, we get to see the cars on the absolute limit, on the ragged edge of their ultimate performance level. You couldn't do that if you had to run your race settings on a Saturday, because you'd have to have the long game in mind in terms of reliability. And that means I think we as fans will be robbed of seeing a car at the absolute limit of its performance. On a Sunday we don't ever see the car on its limit of performance. We see it at the limit of performance within the realms of a long race. But on Saturday I want to see everything cranked right up. I want to see, I'd even go further. We used to have almost a completely separate car for qualifying and the race, different engines, different gearboxes. We'd strip everything that was unnecessary for qualifying off the car to make it, lighter, and it was just we ended up developing almost two completely separate cars, one for the race and one for qualifying. And in the end, that's why it was banned, because the costs were getting out of control. But I like to see what we've got now with this engines with a qualifying mode, just to get the absolute max out of it. We see the best out of the cars, we see the best out of the drivers, and it brings an added spice to that Saturday afternoon qualifying, in my opinion. But let me know what you think. Right, I think that is probably... Oh, let's finish one more. Sorry, one more. Let's finish with this one from Matthew Steer, because I wanted to address this. He says, what do you make of the first lap Kvyat crash and the subsequent penalty? Do you think it should have been put down as a racing incident? I kind of do. I thought it was harsh on Danny Kvyat. When you look at all the different angles, I think it was first lap. There were 3 cars trying to get into space for 2 cars. Yeah, he got a tiny little snap of oversteer, didn't he? But also we've got Norris coming back off the circuit from the left-hand side, squeezing that gap. Sainz desperately trying to get out of trouble. I just thought that was one of those first lap incidents that, you have to give some leeway for the first lap, and normally we've got stewards that do. So I thought it was harsh on Danny Kvyat, and it's one of those things I wonder if reputation precedes you at some times like that, whether stewards will look at him and some of the things that have happened to him in the past and said, look, you've got to stamp this out, we're going to make a thing of it, we're going to hammer you on it. And it felt like a really harsh situation for me. He was already been penalised because he had damage to the car. For me, it didn't need any more than that. But there we go. That's what I thought. Again, let me know your thoughts. Loads to talk about this week. Keep the comments and the questions coming into the mix, because I will continue to answer them for you if I can. But thank you very much for all the ones we've had so far. I hope that's been an interesting Ask Elvis this week. Right, now we need to get into giving away that amazing Michael Schumacher painting. Right, I have my special helper back again, and we are going to pick the winner of the painting. I have got all of the entries using the hashtag GPBCHI. GPBox China was the hashtag, of course, for this one. Lots of you entered. I've got you all on my Instagram page under that hashtag. Ginger, I'm going to scroll all the way up and all the way down and keep going like this all the way through, back and forwards. All I want you to do, put your finger down with your eyes closed, just put your finger down in the middle of the page, whichever one of the Instagram tiles, which of your entries it lands on, will be the winner. Ready? Yeah. Right, so up and down, whenever you're ready, just hit it down in the middle of the page somewhere, wherever you want. Okay, that one. That one?
Yeah.
Open it up. And that is Lashith Niroshan. Lashith Niroshan. I hope I pronounced that right. I will contact you directly, but you, well done, are the winner of that epic Michael Schumacher graffiti style painting. I'll contact you, get your details, and we'll get it out to you this week. Well done.
Well done.
Thank you to everybody who entered. Really appreciate it. There'll be another one, of course, ahead of the Baku Grand Prix. Another prize to give away. Don't know what it is yet, but it'll be awesome. Thank you to TheGPBox.com for making it happen. Thank you to DrAutoArt for the painting itself. In fact, here it is. Ginger, bring it in. There we go. That is brilliant. So well done. That's on its way to you, Lashith Niroshan. And thank you to everybody for taking part, as I say. There you go. Thanks for watching the video. If you've liked it, give it a thumbs up, hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please hit subscribe, I'd appreciate it. And share it around with your mates, and I will be back tomorrow with something else. Ta-da!
Ta-da.